Some anthropologists argue that, sounds like the opinion of other people, some anthropologists argue that the human species could not have survived prehistoric times if the species had not evolved the ability to cope with diverse natural environments. Okay, they're like, hey, we couldn't have survived if we hadn't gained this ability, right? If we hadn't gained this ability to cope with diverse natural environments, then we wouldn't have made it. Sounds good. So, gaining this ability was necessary to our success. However, okay, this is where the disagreement's probably going to come into play, right? There is considerable evidence that, I have no idea how to say that, so I'm just going to say there is considerable evidence that a prehistoric species related to early humans, so some of our cousins, also thrived in a diverse array of environments, but became extinct. So they had the ability to cope with diverse natural environments, but they didn't survive. Hence, conclusion, right? Whatever comes after the word hence is a conclusion. Whatever comes immediately before it is a premise. Hence, the anthropologist's claim is false. Dude, whenever they say something is false so definitively, it's almost always wrong. I mean, that could be true. Maybe it is false, but let's look at the evidence. You do not, by the way, absolutely not need to diagram this on the test. And in fact, I won't diagram it right now. Let's see if I can help you see this intuitively. The first sentence, which is the anthropologist's claim, is like, hey, we couldn't have made it if we hadn't evolved the ability to cope with diverse natural environments. That was something that we absolutely had to do. Without it, we wouldn't have made it. So that's something that we needed. That means that evolving the ability to cope with diverse natural environments is a necessary condition. It's a necessary thing. It was a requirement, right? However, there is evidence that this other species satisfied this necessary condition. They did it. But they didn't survive. They died off. They became extinct. Hence, the original claim must be false. The original claim wasn't saying that being able to cope with many diverse environments was a sufficient condition. That if we could do that, then we would survive. It was saying that it was a necessary condition, that without it, we couldn't have survived. So it's something that we absolutely needed to do. But it was never claiming that, once you do that, you're good to go, right? So this argument seems to be confusing a necessary condition with a sufficient condition by saying, hey, these people met this, what is in fact a necessary condition, this necessary requirement. They were able to survive in many different environments, but they ended up dying off. So what that proves is that being able to cope with many different environments is not a sufficient condition. It won't guarantee that you survive indefinitely, right? Fine. So it's not a sufficient condition. But that doesn't mean that it's not a necessary condition. Things can be necessary and not sufficient. Water is the best example. Water is a necessary condition for life, but just because you have water doesn't mean that you will now survive. If someone says, well, I gave my plants water all the time. They had tons of water, but they didn't survive. Okay, so that means that water is not sufficient. It's not going to guarantee that your plants survive. That doesn't mean that it's now not necessary, right? You could be like, well, sorry your plants didn't make it when you gave them water, but that water still might be necessary. In other words, if you take that water away, maybe they'll definitely die. In any case, so the necessary sufficient thing is going on here. If you're having trouble seeing that, and I hope that you can try to see that intuitively. I mean, it's not like it's necessarily intuitive, but just try to understand that on an intuitive level. That's the ideal, but you can also see this with just drawing, right? The first sentence is if then. So if the species had not evolved, so if they had not evolved this ability to cope, then they would not have survived. That's what this first sentence is saying. Contrapositive. Flip and negate. If they survived, then they must have evolved this ability. Okay? So it's a necessary condition, because the if clause is the sufficient condition, the then clause is the necessary condition. If you want to survive, then you have to evolve this ability. We have this other species that did evolve this ability. Well, I'll give it the AA label. The AA people did evolve this ability, but you know what? The AA people didn't survive. Okay, so if they evolved that ability and they didn't survive, then it must not be the case that E leads to S. This right here cannot be true, because we have people who evolved the ability but didn't survive. So it must not be true that E guarantees S, that if E happens, S will happen. These two facts right here prove this. But the fact that this is true does not have any bearing on this. This is a totally different claim. This is saying, hey, if you survive, then you must have evolved this ability. That's not what this is saying. The problem with this argument is that this person is using this evidence right here, which proves this. That proves that this cannot be true, right? That proves this whole thing right here, as evidence to basically try to get rid of this. Like, this was used to get rid of this claim right here, and they're using this to get rid of this claim. See, it's abstract. This might make things actually more confusing. If it does, just try to remember what we said at the beginning. In any case, the point is that they're confusing necessary and sufficient conditions, right? Maybe you can just focus in on that. This is a sufficient condition, this is a necessary condition. Here, this is a sufficient condition, this is a necessary condition. These two premises right here do a good job of disproving this. They don't do a good job of disproving this. So when the conclusion says, hence, this claim is false, we're like, no, this shows that this claim is false. It doesn't show that that claim is false. So, totally messed up. Actually, this was the original claim, that was the contrapositive. But if you disprove this one, then you'll disprove that one, and vice versa. Okay, so I'm going to go into the answers looking for something that talks about confusion between sufficient and necessary. Answer choice A confuses a conditions being required for a given result to occur in one case. Ugh, so wordy. With the conditions being sufficient for such a result to occur in a similar case. This is what we were talking about, necessary, sufficient. I haven't broken down this answer choice at all, like what exactly is the result and what is the one case and what is the similar case. But that's because I think it might be easier just to get rid of the other four. Then we can go back and talk about it if we want, but this sounds pretty close to what the prediction was, so I would just keep it open. This is how you go through the answers fast. B, takes for granted, in other words, necessarily assumes that if one species had a characteristic that happened to enable it to survive certain conditions, this is wrong. It's not true that any species had a characteristic that happened to enable it to survive. At least one related extinct species must have had the same characteristic. This characteristic, which is the ability to evolve, or the ability to cope with diverse natural environments, is not something that would enable it to survive. It's something that you need in order to survive, but just because you have it doesn't mean that you now will survive, right? That's the whole necessary sufficient thing. So answer choice B says, it takes for granted that if one species had a characteristic that happened to enable it to survive, we don't know if any such existence or such characteristic existed. We only know of necessary characteristics. We don't know of any sufficient characteristics. So this answer choice is wrong. Answer choice C generalizes from the fact that one species with a certain characteristic survived certain conditions. Wait. That all related species with the same characteristic must have survived exactly the same conditions. This is way too, constraining, right? Did one species with a certain characteristic survive? Yeah. Humans, us, survived because we had this characteristic, which was this ability to cope with diverse natural environments. From that fact, did this argument conclude or generalize that all related species with the same characteristic must have survived exactly the same conditions? No, we talked about one other species, not all other species, not all related species, just one other one. And did we say that they must have survived exactly the same conditions? No, if anything, it was just similar conditions or a diverse set of environments, which you could say are similar, but not exactly the same one. There's so many problems with this answer. I hope you weren't tempted by it, but those are some of them. Answer choice D fails to consider the possibility that AA had one or more characteristics that lessened its chances of surviving prehistoric times. Does the argument fail to consider this possibility, that AA had one or more characteristics that lessened its chances of surviving prehistoric times? It does sort of fail to consider this possibility. But that's not really the flaw here, right? The flaw had to do with this necessary sufficient mix-up. So I still like A better than D. I don't feel like D describes what we were talking about. Answer choice at all. But anyways, answer choice E fails to consider the possibility that even if a condition caused a result to occur, it was not necessary to cause the result to occur in a similar case. This is backwards as well. Even if a condition caused a result to occur, they never said that the ability to cope caused them to survive. It was just a necessary requirement. You had to do that in order to survive, but just because you do it doesn't mean that you're now necessarily going to survive. So it may not have caused them to survive. It may have just made it possible for them to possibly survive. Necessary conditions are things that you need to happen. You have to take the LSAT in order to get into law school, but just because you do so doesn't cause you to get into law school, right? There are a lot of people who take the LSAT and they don't get into law school. So, it could, but it doesn't have to, right? So even if a condition caused a result to occur, we don't know if this condition did cause them to survive. It was not necessary to cause the result in a similar case. No, they seem to... It's not describing what's happening here. These guys are really good at writing convoluted answers that seem close, but this is where you can look at these answers part by part, right? Deal with one part of the answer at a time and just ask yourself, is that describing what's happening here? If any part of it does not match up exactly with what's happening, it's out. So I really don't like E. I feel like it's not describing a condition that caused another result. All we know about is conditions that are necessary for another result. So I would get rid of it. I'm going to go back to A. I never broke it down to figure out exactly what part fits with what. And since these 4 answers, B, C, D, and E, are, like, I didn't like them, but it wasn't like I was like, oh yeah. I mean, I guess I did think they were definitely wrong, but if they're still hazy to you, another way to choose an answer is to see why one seems to make a lot of sense, right? So let's take a look at A. Confuses a conditions being required for a given result. What was the condition that was required for a given result? The condition was the ability to cope with diverse environments. Confuses a conditions being required for a given result. The given result was to survive in one case, in the case of humans, in the case of us, our ancestors, or the human species. It confuses that condition with the conditions being sufficient for such a result, for surviving, in a similar case with the AA. This is exactly what's happening. This argument is confusing what is in fact necessary for survival, in one case, human species, with the conditions being sufficient. Over here it's now sufficient for survival, for such a result to occur in a similar case, AA. It's got to be A. So let's triple check. Let's choose A.